One single game. That's it. 90 minutes into the 2026 FIFA World Cup, and Tunisia has already pulled off something no national team has managed in 96 years of this tournament. Nobody. Not Argentina in 2002 when they crashed out in the group stage. Not Germany in 2018 when South Korea sent them home. Not Italy in '74. In nearly a century of World Cup history, no country had ever done what Tunisia just did. And if you think this was just a knee-jerk reaction to one rough night in Mexico, you have no idea what was already burning behind that dressing room door. This channel tracked every frame of what happened in Guadalupe, every press conference in the lead-up, every rumor that leaked out of the Tunisian camp over the last 5 weeks. And what we're about to walk you through here isn't an impulsive decision. It's the detonation of a time bomb that had been ticking long before the opening whistle. If you're a World Cup fan and you actually want to understand what's happening away from the cameras, this video is for you. And it's worth sticking around because later on I'm going to show you a detail inside the Tunisian training center that nobody in mainstream coverage is talking about. A detail that on its own was already enough to get any head coach fired. And that explains exactly why this federation pulled the trigger faster than any other in World Cup history. Let's start where every media outlet on the planet is starting. The scoreline. Pause. Sunday night. Estadio Monterrey, in the city of Guadalupe, Mexico. Tunisia's opening match at the 2026 World Cup against Sweden. And what unfolded on that pitch wasn't a football match. It was an execution. 5-1. Sweden 5. Tunisia 1. One of the worst opening game defeats Tunisia has ever suffered at a World Cup. The Swedish attack sliced through the Tunisian backline like it wasn't even there. Alexander Isak scored. Victor Gyökeres scored. Matthias Svanberg scored. Name after name, goal after goal, minute after minute. The Tunisian defense looked completely lost out there. Players standing still watching the ball go in. No idea where to run. No idea who was marking who. But the goal that hurt the most wasn't any of those three. The goal that hurt the most came off the boot of a 22-year-old kid that almost nobody in the Tunisian dressing room expected to face that night. A Swedish midfielder named Yassine Ayari. And it wasn't just one goal. It was two. A brace. 2 goals from a player whose father was born in Tunisia against his father's own country in the opening game of the World Cup. Think about that for a second. A Tunisian son scored twice against Tunisia in the first match of the biggest football tournament on the planet. There's no crueler way to script an opening night. After the match, Tunisia's head coach, Sabri Lamouchi, had to face the cameras. And he used a line that would be remembered a lot longer than he probably expected. He said, and I'm quoting him, "We are shooting ourselves in the foot. We are hurting ourselves." He had no clue how right he was, because within 24 hours of saying that, he was gone. Pause. Now, from the outside, sacking a head coach after a single game looks like madness. Looks like panic. Looks like a federation that completely lost its mind in the middle of a World Cup. And that reaction makes sense. Nobody in the entire history of this tournament had ever done it before. And when something has never happened, the natural instinct is to assume whoever did it messed up. But hold on to that reaction for a second. Because the moment you pull back the curtain on that dressing room and see what was actually happening behind closed doors in the weeks leading up to this opener, the story shifts completely. Lamouchi didn't fall because of one game against Sweden. Lamouchi fell because that game was just the excuse the Tunisian Federation had been waiting for. And this is where the story gets genuinely sinister. Because there's stuff inside this that involves the head coach's own son. It involves a player storming off the pitch in front of a global audience. It involves a run of results so embarrassing that nobody in the country wanted to defend the guy anymore. And it involves a historical record that Tunisia just set without meaning to. So the question we're left with is this. Did Tunisia just make the boldest call of the 2026 World Cup? Or did they hit the panic button and torch their own tournament before it even really started? Hang on to that question. Because over the next few blocks, you're going to find out that the answer is anything but simple. Come back with me inside Estadio Monterrey. 9 o'clock local time. Guadalupe, Mexico. A stadium packed with fans, most of them decked out in yellow and blue Swedish colors, with a handful of Tunisians scattered lost in the middle. On the other side of the screen, millions of Arab viewers glued to their TVs, hoping to watch their country do what it promises every year at a World Cup. Get past the group stage, make the people proud, prove that Tunisia is a national team that commands respect on the global stage. Sweden started the match like they already knew exactly what they were going to do. In the opening minutes, the ball moved around Sweden's midfield with a calmness that gave the whole thing away. This wasn't a nervous debutante team. This was a team that had studied Tunisia's defense for weeks and knew exactly where to break in. And break in they did. Sweden's first goal came in the first half and mentally destroyed the Tunisian national team before halftime. Alexander Isak, one of the sharpest strikers in the Premier League, popped up inside the box and didn't miss. It wasn't a lucky goal. It was a studied goal. The Tunisian defense left a lane through the middle, the pass slid through it, and Isak did what he does with his eyes closed. What came next was worse. Before the halftime whistle, Sweden had already doubled the lead. Victor Gyökeres, that physical monster Arsenal signed for a fortune, finished from inside the box like he was in training. 2-0. The Tunisian dressing room walked back into the tunnel with their heads down, Swedish fans singing, and the World Cup for Tunisia was already looking done. Then came the second half. And if you thought there'd be some tactical adjustment, some rousing halftime speech, some pride-driven response, you were wrong. What came out in the second half was the massacre turning into humiliation. Mattias Svanberg scored 3-0, and it was in that moment that the whole night flipped into full-blown horror movie territory for Tunisia, because one of the Swedish players was preparing to celebrate in a very specific way. And he had a very specific reason for it. Yassine Ayari, 22 years old, midfielder for Brighton in England. Born in Sweden, raised in Sweden, playing for the Swedish national team since the youth levels. But his father was born in Tunisia. And it was that 22-year-old kid, the son of a Tunisian, who put 2 goals past the defense of his own father's country on opening night at the World Cup. Not 1 goal, 2. The first came in the middle of the second half. 4-0. The second landed shortly after. 5-0. 5-0 at a World Cup, with a Tunisian son scoring 2 of them. Is there a worse way to lose an opener? Probably not. Tunisia did pull one back late, a consolation goal that basically nobody in the stadium celebrated because it didn't matter anymore. 5-1. Final scoreline. One of the worst opening game defeats in the recent history of the CAF, the African Confederation. And the statistical summary of the match is even more brutal than the scoreline suggests. Sweden dominated possession, dominated shots on target, dominated territory. Tunisia barely crossed the halfway line for stretches of 20, 30 minutes at a time. But I need you to pay attention to one very specific detail from this match. A detail that most of the Tunisian press glossed over the next morning, but that was probably the most revealing moment of the entire night. 72 minutes in, the scoreline was already 5-0. Sabri Lamouchi, the head coach, saw he needed to make some kind of change, more for the sake of dignity than results, because the game had been decided long ago. And he decided to pull one of Tunisia's defenders, Yohan Benalouane. Benalouane is a veteran player, with time at Leicester in England, with a long European career behind him. He's not some 20-year-old kid. He's a guy who's seen everything in professional football. But Benalouane didn't walk off the pitch the way a veteran player, who respects his manager's decision on a bad night, walks off. Benalouane walked off in front of a national TV audience, visibly furious, with his own head coach, in front of the entire world. And that was the moment when it became clear to anyone paying attention that Tunisia's problem that night wasn't just tactical. It wasn't just the 5-1 on the scoreboard. The problem was inside the dressing room, long before the ball started rolling. And that's what we're going to break down in the next block. Come back with me to those 72 minutes. 5-0. Tunisia had stopped trying to react. Sweden had stopped pushing forward. Everyone in the stadium knew this was a game running out the clock. The Tunisian fans still inside were quieter than an empty arena. And it was in that moment, with the game already dead and buried, that Sabri Lamouchi decided to make a change. He called for the 4th official. The electronic board went up. The number coming off was defender Yohan Benalouane. And this is where things get interesting. Benalouane isn't just any player. He's not a 20-year-old rookie who accepts whatever the coach decides without a word. He's a guy who played in the Premier League, played at Leicester, passed through France, Italy, England. A veteran defender who knows exactly how a professional is supposed to behave on live TV when his team is getting hammered 5-0. You walk off with your head down. You shake the hand of the player replacing you. You sit on the bench. You swallow your anger for later. End of story. That's not what happened. Benalouane walked off the pitch with a firm stride, head held high, looking straight at the bench. And what the camera caught in the seconds that followed went viral on Tunisian social media before the final whistle. He walked past the touchline looking at Lamouchi the way any football fan on earth recognizes instantly. It wasn't disappointment. It wasn't sadness. It was rage. Pure rage. Rage at his own head coach. In front of the whole world. A player from your own national team, in the middle of a World Cup opener, walking off furious at his own commander on live TV. That's not just a rough night at the office. That's a relationship that was already broken before that game even started. Now, before I go further, quick moment. If this breakdown is landing with you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more World Cup fans who want the real story instead of the surface-level takes. 1 second of your time. Big difference for us. Back to the story. Because in the days leading up to Tunisia's opener, the journalists covering the delegation had been reporting a strange atmosphere at the training center. Nothing explicit. Nothing on the record. Nobody speaking with their name attached. But the sources kept saying, all pointing the same direction, the same thing. The Tunisian dressing room wasn't with Lamouchi. Complaints about the starting lineup. Complaints about the tactical setup. Complaints about tactical meetings that players said were confusing, contradictory, changing from one session to the next with no explanation. Some of the veterans in the squad, according to those reports, had already signaled to the federation that things weren't right. That communication between the coach and the players had basically ground to a halt in the past few weeks. And here's where the story gains an extra layer that most channels aren't touching. Because when the Ben Louane substitution happened at that 72nd minute, it wasn't an isolated event. It was the on-camera version of something that had been playing out inside the dressing room for weeks. Ben Louane didn't explode because of one substitution in a lost game. He exploded because a slow-boiling internal pressure finally cracked open on the wrong camera, the wrong night, on the biggest stage possible. A veteran doing that at a World Cup means something very specific in national team culture. It means he wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. It means he already knew, or at least suspected, that the coach wasn't going to be there much longer. And if a squad veteran was already behaving like that on live TV, imagine how the rest of them were behaving in closed training sessions off camera, out of public view. And there's one more detail from that night that flew right past most of the international sports press. Rewatch the replay of Tunisia's substitutions. You'll notice something in the players' expressions on the bench. Nobody moved to console Lamouchi in any visible way. No collective embrace. No sign of unity. The assistant coaches stayed close, sure, but the actual players on the bench kept a distance that felt deliberate. A united dressing room loses together. A fractured dressing room scatters. And that's exactly what you saw when the ball stopped rolling in Guadeloupe. Now all of this is signals. Strong signals, but still just signals. You could look at all of that and ask, okay, but where's the confirmation from someone with a name, with weight, with authority, saying that Lamouchi's dismissal was inevitable even before the World Cup started? Don't worry, because when we get to the next block, you're going to see that this list of voices is a lot longer than you'd think. And it comes from everywhere, from inside the Tunisian Federation itself, from former national team players, from journalists who've been covering this squad for 20 years, from European commentators who've seen this movie before. The case against Lamouchi was already being built, and it was already a lot more solid than that one game against Sweden could ever justify on its own. Let's talk about what was being said about Lamouchi before the ball rolled in Guadeloupe, because that, more than anything else, explains why the sacking happened this fast. Start with the French press. Lamouchi is French. He worked for years in European football, managed Ivory Coast, had a stint at Nottingham Forest in England. He's a familiar name in French sports columns in Paris, which means the journalists who've been tracking his career since his playing days are spread across Ligue 1 and the Premier League, and they write about him with real candor. They're not blind fans. And what that press had been publishing in the weeks leading up to the World Cup was consistent. Sabri Lamouchi's project in Tunisia wasn't working. It lacked tactical clarity, it lacked connection with the group, it lacked results. Columnists with 30 years of experience at heavyweight outlets were saying off the record that the Tunisian Federation had been regretting the hire pretty much from month one. Move on to the Tunisian press. That's the one that hurt more. Tunisian journalists who've been covering the national team for decades, the guys who were there during the '78 World Cup, the '98 World Cup, the 2018 World Cup, started ramping up their criticism in a coordinated way in the weeks before this tournament. It wasn't one isolated commentator swinging at the coach out of frustration. It was the consensus of the Tunisian sports media saying, with real bylines at real publications, that this national team was disconnected, that the training sessions weren't working, that the tactical scheme seemed to change from meeting to meeting. and that players were starting to publicly doubt the head coach's decisions. That's not fan grumbling. That's the professional media saying openly that the commander had lost command. Move to former players of the national team. Here's where it gets even more revealing. Former athletes who wore the Tunisian jersey at past World Cups, guys who now work as pundits on Arab sports channels, guys respected inside the national team dressing room. These people had been dropping increasingly harsh comments. One of them went on a live broadcast on Gulf Regional TV and said that Tunisia was going into a World Cup with the worst dressing room atmosphere he had ever seen in the history of the national team. And keep in mind, this guy played at a World Cup. He's not some outside analyst commenting from the sidelines. He's a guy who lived World Cup dressing rooms and said on the record that this group was fractured. Move to the European analysts who cover African football. CAF, the African Confederation, has a whole network of specialist commentators covering national teams from the continent. And those people, who are usually pretty careful and tend to avoid direct criticism of active head coaches, started dropping increasingly pessimistic assessments about Tunisia in the days leading up to the World Cup. Words like disorganized, incoherent, lacking tactical identity showed up in published analyses at European specialist outlets, all pointing to the same issue. A coach who wasn't managing to build a team in the 5 weeks of preparation he had available. And if you think this is still just press opinion, pundit chatter, take a look at the cold numbers of the Lamouchi era in Tunisia. 5 official matches. 1 win. 1. And it was a 1-0 win over Haiti in a warm-up game against a team that didn't even qualify for the World Cup. Beyond that, Tunisia had 2 goalless draws, 1 defeat, and another defeat. 5 matches. 1 win. 20% winning percentage for a coach who took over the national team promising to rebuild the squad for a World Cup in 5 months. And I need you to pay attention to this next detail because it's what separates a coach going through a rough patch from a coach with a broken project. Over those 5 matches, Tunisia scored 2 goals. 2 in 5 matches. One of them against Haiti, the other against Sweden when the game was already 5-0. That's not a temporary tactical difficulty. That's a national team that completely forgot how to create offensive chances. When you put the numbers together with the French press, the Tunisian press, the former players, the European analysts specializing in CAF, you're not talking about one guy's opinion or another. You're talking about a technical consensus spanning 3 continents, all saying the same thing. This project wasn't working, and there was nowhere left to go without breaking completely. But the Tunisian Federation had 2 more reasons to pull the trigger, and neither of them had anything to do with the scoreline against Sweden. One of them was a series of preseason warm-up results that were screaming alarms weeks in advance. And the other one is an episode inside Tunisia's own training center that's so bizarre that when I tell you about it, you're going to understand exactly why the Federation's patience ran out. Let's go step by step. Next block, the warm-up games that should have alerted everyone. 5 weeks before the World Cup, Tunisia needed to sort out 2 things fast. First, adjust the tactical system that had been fluctuating since Lamouchi arrived. Second, get their starters minutes of playing time ahead of the opener against Sweden. To do that, the Tunisian Federation set up 2 high-profile friendlies in Europe against 2 well-established national teams. Austria first, Belgium second. You already know where the story ends up, but the details are worse than they sound. The first friendly was against Austria. And Austria in 2026 is a solid European national team, second tier by continental standards, but organized, competitive, nowhere near the monsters of the continent. Against that kind of opponent, a team heading to a World Cup needs to at minimum walk off the pitch with some dignity. Draw if possible. Win ideally. Create chances. Show a pattern of play. Tunisia lost 1-0. Didn't score. Didn't create anything meaningful. And they walked off the field getting sarcastic applause from the Tunisian press in attendance. Right there, the first article started dropping words no coach wants to read about his own work: toothless, clueless, disconnected. That was the first public sign that the project wasn't progressing. And that's also when the social media atmosphere in Tunisia started turning organized against the head coach. But the worst was still coming. A few days later came what was supposed to be the toughest test of preseason, a friendly against Belgium. And here you need some context. The Belgium of 2026 isn't the golden generation Belgium of Prime, Hazard, and Kevin De Bruyne anymore. But it's still a top-tier national team, packed with elite European talent, playing high-level football. Losing to Belgium isn't a disgrace. losing to Belgium with the bare minimum of tactical resistance, conceding 2 or 3 goals, creating some offensive threat that's acceptable for any national team on earth that isn't Brazil, Argentina, or France. Tunisia didn't lose. Tunisia got humiliated. 5-0. Again. 5-0 against Belgium in a friendly. A week and a half before facing Sweden in the World Cup opener. And the summary of that game is even more alarming than the scoreline alone. Tunisia barely made it into the attacking half during the entire second half. The defense collapsed in the first 10 minutes and never recovered. The Belgian press, which is known for being polite about opponents in friendlies, published pieces with headlines that were borderline sympathy. Stuff like, Tunisia heading to World Cup in freefall, Tunisian squad worries European preparators. Do the math on the 2 friendlies calmly. 2 preseason games heading into a World Cup. 0 goals scored, 6 goals conceded, no wins, no draws, nothing positive to bring into the dressing room as moral capital for the opener. Absolutely nothing. Just defeats, goals against, press reinforcing the same diagnosis that had been circulating since the first months of Lamouchi's tenure. And this is when the number that closes the whole cycle shows up. 5 games. 1 guy managing the Tunisian national team. 5 matches, mixing warm-ups and official tests. Let's go through the whole ledger carefully. 1 win. 1. Against Haiti. 1-0. A preseason friendly. Against a team that wasn't even in the World Cup. 2 goalless draws against teams of modest technical level. 1 loss before the European tour. Then the 2 European friendlies, both considered the decisive tests, lost both. Belgium 5-0. Austria 1-0. Close the ledger and you get this. 1 win, 2 draws, and 2 losses across 5 matches. 2 goals scored. 11 goals conceded, counting the World Cup opener. An absolutely unsustainable win percentage for any coach who took over a national team promising short-term rebuilding. And the detail that seals the case. Sabri Lamouchi signed his contract with Tunisia through 2028. Through 2028. That's nearly 3 years of contracted project, guaranteed salary, cycle running through the next Africa Cup, continuity through the next World Cup. That's how the Tunisian Federation introduced him to the country 5 months ago. 5 months. That's how long Lamouchi lasted of a 3-year contract. Do you get the size of the hole that project had fallen into? A federation doesn't rip up a 3-year contract after 5 months and 1 loss if there's any hope left in the commander. It only rips it up if senior leadership already lost confidence a long time ago, if the players already signaled they weren't following, if the press had been hammering for weeks, and if the numbers were an alarm shouting in the boardroom's face. All those conditions were present. All of them. And there's still one last piece to this story that makes everything you've seen so far look secondary. There's an episode that happened inside Tunisia's training center, the same detail I promised you back in the opening of this video, and involves Sabri Lamouchi's own son. That's where the technical case against the coach became an institutional case. That's when the federation decided he wouldn't get 1 more match. Now I'm going to tell you the detail I've been holding back since the start of this video. And I want you to pay attention because this is where the Sabri Lamouchi case stopped being a technical problem and became an institutional crisis inside the Tunisian Football Federation. Come back with me to the weeks of national team prep for the World Cup. Tunisia had built a dedicated training center for this camp, with strict access protocol, with an official list of who could enter and who couldn't. This isn't a frill. World Cup national team camps have stricter access rules than most government meetings, players, official coaching staff, registered fitness coaches, medical staff, security, and federation representatives. Period. Outside that list, nobody enters. Not family, not friends, not special guests, not press without credentials. The reason for that rule is obvious. Tactical leaks. Distractions in the squad. Breaking the psychological bubble a national team needs to hold during a World Cup. And it's such an elementary norm in world football that nobody, under normal conditions, even questions it. But Sabri Lamouchi decided he was the exception. According to reports that started circulating in the Tunisian press and European specialist media covering the World Cup, Lamouchi brought his own son into Tunisia's training center during the days of preparation for the opener against Sweden. Not in an official capacity. Not credentialed. Not as part of the national delegation. As the coach's personal guest. Walking around the training center like it was an extension of his home. To someone outside football, that might sound like a minor detail. A father wanting his son close during a big moment of his career. Emotionally understandable. But within the institutional logic of a federation organizing a national team for a World Cup, that's a serious protocol violation. And it was treated as a serious violation by the Tunisian Federation officials who noticed his presence inside. The question came directly, what is this person doing here? Why is someone who isn't part of Tunisia's official delegation walking around the national team's camp during full World Cup preparation? And most importantly, with whose authorization? Lamouchi was called to explain that, formally, by senior federation leadership, days before the ball rolled against Sweden. Hold on to that scene for a second, because it's important. A national team head coach being forced to justify himself before federation directors before the first game of a World Cup over a personal guest circulating in the National Training Center. That's not a tactical disagreement. That's the board saying, no words minced, that they've lost faith in the commander's judgment, that they no longer believe his decisions, that they're already monitoring his behavior like he's under suspicion. And that's where the whole story makes sense. Think through the full scenario with all the pieces on the table now. The Tunisian Federation was watching the following facts at the same time, all converging on the same conclusion. 1. Results in the Lamouchi era were a statistical disaster. 1 win in 5 games, 5-0 against Belgium, 1-0 against Austria. 2. Tunisian press, French press, and European CAF specialist media had already destroyed the project publicly. 3. Squad veterans had already signaled, through anonymous but repeated sources, that communication with the coach had broken down. 4. Training sessions, according to reports circulating among journalists, were confusing and contradictory. And 5. The last and maybe the worst of all, the coach himself had been caught breaking institutional protocol inside the training center, forcing federation directors to call him in for an explanation, like he was an employee under investigation. Putting all of that together, what's left of Sabri Lamouchi's authority in front of that squad, that press, that federation? Nothing. Literally nothing left. He was walking into the World Cup opener as a coach with no credit, no trust, no institutional backing, no press support, and a rationally discontented dressing room. The only thing that could still save his head was an exceptional result in the opener. Not a good result. An extraordinary one. Some kind of clear signal that the squad still followed him, that the project still had life. What he got was a 5-1 against Sweden, with Ben Louane storming off in a national broadcast, with a Tunisian son scoring twice against his father's country, with the national defense looking lost on the pitch. It wasn't the game that brought Lamouchi down. The game just confirmed what the federation already knew, and it gave them the public excuse they'd been waiting for to pull the trigger without having to give the country a long explanation. A historic defeat is enough of a reason for any fan base to swallow a lightning-fast sacking. That was the stated reason. The real reason had already been built long before. Except this lightning sacking has a feature that a lot of people still haven't picked up on. It's literally unprecedented. Nobody, in nearly a century of World Cup history, had done what Tunisia just did. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next block. Let me show you why Sabri Lamouchi's dismissal just entered the shortlist of the rarest events in world football history. Because when you look at nearly 100 years of World Cup competition, you'll notice that changing coaches mid-tournament actually does have precedent. There are famous cases, some well-known, others fading with time. But what Tunisia just did doesn't match any of those precedents. And the reason lies specifically in the speed of the decision. Let's go through the previous cases one by one so you understand. Start with Tunisia itself. Yes, you read that right, because this isn't the first time Tunisia has fired a coach mid-World Cup. In 1998, at the France World Cup, the Tunisian national team was managed by Henryk Kasperczak, a Polish coach well known in African football. Tunisia had a difficult opening game, and the second one didn't come better either. So with 2 stumbles in a row, the federation decided to fire Kasperczak still during the tournament. But notice the difference in context. Kasperczak was fired after 2 games, not 1. And even then, the decision was considered radical at the time. It was headline news around the world. And it left Tunisia with the label of the federation that sacks its coach mid-World Cup. Now, almost 3 decades later, the same country just shortened its own record. 2 games became 1. What was already radical in 1998 became almost unthinkable in 2026. Move on to South Korea. At the same 1998 France World Cup, Cha Bum-Kwon was the head coach of the South Korean national team. A legendary former player of Korean football with a historic Bundesliga career in Germany. A hugely respected figure. But he took charge of a World Cup and watched South Korea take 2 beatings in a row. After the second stumble, the South Korean Federation also pulled the trigger and fired him mid-tournament. Second time in history. Second national team. Second sacking mid-World Cup. And once again, both cases, Tunisia 98 and South Korea 98, involved at minimum 2 matches played. Nobody had the guts, or maybe the recklessness, to do that swap after a single game. Then there's Spain in 2018, which is the most famous case in history for completely different reasons. Julen Lopetegui was Spain's head coach. Good coach, young, with a consistent track record in the federation. But 2 days before Spain's World Cup opener in Russia, the bombshell dropped. Lopetegui had signed, in secret, a contract to take over Real Madrid. Without telling the Spanish Federation. Without consulting anyone. He had just closed the deal under the table and planned to jump to Madrid right after the World Cup. The Spanish Federation found out, went furious, and fired Lopetegui 2 days before the ball rolled against Portugal. Note carefully, fired before the World Cup started. Not during. Before. It was a unique case, involving a breach of trust regarding future commitment to another club, and even then it became one of the biggest institutional scandals in national team history. Now that you have the 3 historical cases in your head, look at what Tunisia just did. It wasn't before the World Cup started, like the Lopetegui case. It was after the ball rolled. It wasn't after 2 games like the Kasper Zak case in 1998 or Cha Bum Kuan at the same World Cup. It was after exactly 1. A single match. 90 minutes of official football. And the head coach was out. Contract ripped up through 2028. Command changed. Replacement announced. Less than 24 hours after the final whistle of the opener against Sweden. In nearly 100 years of World Cup history. Not one national team. Not one case. Zero precedent for this. Tunisia just set, without meaning to, the historic record for the fastest sacking during a World Cup ever registered. A record that's probably going to stand for a long time, because even in absurdly desperate contexts, no federation had ever had the guts to move with this kind of speed. Not Germany during their biggest historic embarrassments. Not Argentina during chaotic campaigns. Not Italy during early exits. Nobody. Tunisia 2026. Sabri Lamouchi. First case in history. 1 match. 1 sacking. Written in world football's record books forever. And here comes the question that naturally follows this kind of data. How does a federation reach this level of aggressive decision-making? Where does all that speed come from? All that impatience? All that willingness to pull the trigger before any other federation has pulled it in history? Don't worry, because the answer lies in what happened to Tunisia's previous head coach. The guy Lamouchi replaced. And what happened to that guy should have been a warning to Sabri Lamouchi from the day he signed the contract. Next block, the institutional pattern of the Tunisian Federation. And why this lightning sacking story isn't really new in this country. Now I'm going to do something you probably didn't expect from this video. I'm going to stop hitting Sabri Lamouchi for 10 minutes and defend him honestly. Because there's a real argument on his side. And if we don't put that argument on the table, this analysis becomes dishonest. Start with the most obvious of all. The time he had. 5 months. That's the total window Sabri Lamouchi had to take over a national team, understand the available squad, evaluate every active player in European leagues, install a playing philosophy, build a tactical system, pick the 23-man roster for the World Cup, and arrive at competitive level for the opener against Sweden. 5 months. No coach in world football thinks that's enough. Not one. You pick up any national team management manual, any interview with an experienced World Cup coach, any analysis of a successful national team project, and everyone will tell you the same thing. It needs a cycle. It needs time. It needs at least 2 years to build a World Cup team. Lamouchi had 5 months. Period. Any honest diagnosis of his work needs to start by recognizing that structural limitation. And it didn't stop there. Because he didn't inherit a rested, prepared national team just waiting for him. He inherited a broken one. His predecessor, Sami Trabelsi, had just been fired after the humiliating AFCON exit against Mali. That means the squad Lamouchi received was already coming off shock, low morale, hostile press, a dressing room already doubting the technical command. That's not an easy inheritance. It's basically being handed a national team in collective therapy and asked to make it perform at a World Cup in under half a year. Second point, look at the opponent quality on opening night. Sweden in 2026 is not just any opponent. It's a solid European national team with players at the top of the Premier League. Alexander Isak has been putting the ball in the net all season in England. Victor Gyökeres is a physical attacking monster any defense on earth fears. Yacine Ayari is one of the most promising midfielders in Europe, playing regularly at an English club. That's not a beatable squad. That's a national team that could perfectly well steamroll two-thirds of the teams in this World Cup. Losing to Sweden isn't the problem in itself. The scoreline was embarrassing, yes. The 5-1 hurts. But if you set aside the 5-1 and focus only on the fact that Tunisia lost to an objectively superior team in individual quality, there aren't many coaches on earth who would have done something profoundly different in that situation. Maybe Guardiola could minimize the scoreline. Maybe Ancelotti could organize the defense better. But when? Against that Tunisian group with 5 months of work? Difficult. Extremely difficult. Third argument in Lamouchi's favor. His resume isn't empty. This guy didn't parachute into Tunisia. Sabri Lamouchi managed Ivory Coast at the 2014 Brazil World Cup and led the Ivorian national team to a respectable campaign, coming very close to knockout stage qualification in an era when Ivory Coast had players like Yaya Touré, Didier Drogba, Kolo Touré. That's not an amateur resume. After that, he had consistent work at Nottingham Forest in England, achieving playoff qualification for Premier League promotion. In other words, this guy is a real coach with recognized work, with a track record of results in complex situations. Calling him a permanent failure over 5 months in an impossible context is aggressive reductionism. And fourth point, this one is more delicate, but needs to be said. The story about the son at the training center may have been inflated. Notice this, who leaked that information to the press? Anonymous sources inside the federation. The same sources that already wanted to see Lamouchi out of the job. If the Tunisian Federation Board was already building the case to fire him, it makes strategic sense to also say he broke protocol. It makes sense to embed an institutional justification inside a narrative that was already forming. That doesn't mean the episode is false. It means the reading of it may have been dramatized to reinforce a decision the Federation already wanted to justify. And Benalouane storming off angry on the substitution? Any veteran in football reacts badly to being pulled in a lost game after already conceding 5. That's athlete ego, not necessarily rupture with the coaching command. Reading that scene as a sign of internal crisis may be post-defeat overinterpretation by the press. Put it all together, the short window, the broken inheritance, the superior opponent, the coach's real resume, the possible inflation of internal episodes, and you get a picture that definitely isn't of an incompetent commander. It's of a competent coach thrown into an impossible situation with the time frame he was given. So looking at it from this angle, did the Tunisian Federation really do the right thing? Or was it institutional cowardice? Was it a solution to a real problem, or just passing the bomb along? Sit with that doubt for a moment. Because in the next block, despite everything we just acknowledged, I'm going to show you why the Tunisian Federation may still have made the correct decision. And why the arguments in Lamouchi's favor, real as they are, don't survive the standard a national team needs to hold at a World Cup. Everything we discussed in the last block is true. Word for word. Sabri Lamouchi had too short a window, inherited a broken team, faced a superior opponent, and has a real resume as a competent coach. None of that is invention. None of that can be dismissed. But the World Cup isn't a place for biographical justice. And that's where the Tunisian Federation has an argument to defend its decision. Because the moment a national team enters a tournament of this magnitude, the evaluation criteria changes completely. It no longer matters how much time the coach had to prepare. It no longer matters the inherited context. It no longer matters whether the opponent was objectively superior. What matters inside the tournament is one thing only. You have 4 weeks to try to produce results with the material you have, and every match played costs an irreplaceable unit within the group stage. You can't waste a game. You can't waste preparation between games. You can't waste an opportunity for tactical adjustment. Every second inside a World Cup is worth gold. And that's what Lamouchi failed to do with those 90 minutes against Sweden. It's not about the scoreline. It's about what the scoreline revealed. What that 5-1 made clear is that Tunisia had no defined playing pattern, no functional defensive block, no working build-up scheme, no reference figure in attack, no dressing room leaders overriding the younger players in moments of pressure, no recognizable collective choreography in any area of the field. After 5 months of work, the Tunisian national team arrived at a World Cup opener with no identity. That's not an individual talent problem. That's a diagnosis of a coaching project that never took off. And if the coaching project didn't take off in 5 months of preparation, what makes you think it would take off in 5 days between the Sweden match and the next one against Japan? Here's the cold math the Tunisian Federation had to run in the hours after the loss. Tunisia is in the same group as Sweden, Japan, and the Netherlands. 3 technically superior national teams. Already lost the first one. They'd need, at minimum, to grab points against Japan and survive against the Netherlands to have any chance of second-round qualification. And how do you make those points? You need defensive organization, you need a collective pattern, you need a dressing room united around the commander. You need those 3 things at the same time. Lamouchi had delivered 0 of those 3 in 5 months. 0. It's not reasonable to expect him to deliver any of them in 5 days, with internal atmosphere destroyed, with press pressure mounting, and with a player storming off on live TV. In that scenario, keeping Lamouchi would practically mean accepting Tunisia's elimination without even trying a different card. It would mean holding technical command out of contractual loyalty while the team descended into a 3rd straight loss and headed home without a single point on the board. Is that responsible management, or is that blind rigidity to a schedule that's already proven unworkable? The Federation chose not to accept it, chose to try one last card, chose to change command in a hope that a new head could find some emotional and tactical configuration the previous commander couldn't. It might not work. It probably won't work. But at least there's a real chance different from 0. And 0 is what would have been left keeping Lamouchi. And there's a second layer of this decision that needs to be recognized. Broken trust can't be repaired at a World Cup. There's no time for it. If Federation leadership no longer trusted Lamouchi because of the training center episode, and if the players were already signaling discontent to press sources, and if veterans were already storming off on live TV, is there any realistic way to rebuild that trust in 4 days between Sweden and Japan? There isn't. None. An honest person looking at the internal dynamics of that group would conclude that even if Lamouchi got a symbolic second chance, he'd no longer be able to command that dressing room effectively. Every tactical order of his would be filtered by players doubting him. Every substitution would be read as pettiness. Every pre-game speech would be heard with accumulated distrust. In that kind of environment, no coach wins an important game. None. Even the best in the world lose command power when the dressing room decides not to follow. So that's the Tunisian Federation's defense. It's not pretty. It's not gentlemanly toward a professional who had a short time frame and adverse circumstance. It's not justice in the human sense. But it's a pragmatic decision inside a context where the options were practically only 2. Keep the commander and accept elimination with contractual dignity, or change the commander and try one final card with someone new, knowing full well the risk of making everything worse. The Federation chose to try. And they went and got a very specific guy to try. Someone who's already commanded 2 historic World Cup shocks. Someone who knows exactly what it means to be called in the middle of chaos to try to squeeze milk from a stone. And that guy is already on the ground in Monterrey. He's already inside the Tunisian training center. He's already starting to build the mindset for the Japan game. And that guy, who's probably the most fascinating thing Tunisia could have done in this moment, is what we're going to talk about in the next block. If you follow African football or National Team World Cup football, you've probably heard of this guy. If you haven't, pay attention because he's one of the most fascinating characters in world football today. Crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up above the elbow. Silver gray hair. A tall physical presence that stands out at any touchline he appears at. Calm voice. Military commander posture. He walks the technical area like he owns the stadium. And that guy, exactly that guy, is who the Tunisian Federation went and got to take over the national team in the middle of a World Cup. His name is Hervé Renard, French, and he just joined an absurdly exclusive club in world football, commanding 3 consecutive World Cups with 3 different national teams. Hold on to that fact because it's too rare to skim over. Morocco in 2018, Saudi Arabia in 2022, Tunisia in 2026. 3 straight World Cups, 3 different national teams. 3 different countries, 3 different continental fan bases. It's practically impossible to find another active coach with this kind of trajectory. Renard has become a kind of international firefighter for national teams that need a miracle in a moment of crisis. Federations around the world know that when he's available, he's a card that can flip an entire campaign. And the reason for this status comes from one specific event, an event that happened at the last World Cup and that nobody who watched has forgotten. 2022 World Cup. Qatar. Argentina's first match of the tournament. Opponent, Saudi Arabia. Coached by whom? Hervé Renard. Nobody on the planet, honestly nobody, expected anything other than a comfortable Argentina win. Lionel Messi was on the pitch, possibly playing his last World Cup, chasing the trophy he was still missing. The Argentine squad was stacked with elite European talent at every position. Saudi Arabia, on paper, was a second-tier opponent in a virtually ceremonial opener. What happened in that game went down as one of the biggest upsets ever recorded at a World Cup. Saudi Arabia, in the second half, flipped the scoreline against Argentina. 2-1. Argentina walked off the field devastated. Messi spent days absorbing the emotional shock. Saudi Arabia flew home to a national celebration. And Renard, that French coach in a white shirt, became instantly mythological in national team football. The detail? Argentina, from that World Cup, went on to win the tournament. That means Renard didn't make Saudi Arabia beat a middling opponent on opening night. He made Saudi Arabia beat the future world champions in the tournament opener. That's pure national team football history. And it's not just that. Renard has another mark that's maybe even more impressive than the win over Argentina. He's the only coach in history to win the Africa Cup of Nations with 2 different national teams. That's not an exaggeration. It's registered fact. In 2012, he lifted the trophy with Zambia, a team nobody had on the radar as a candidate. It was a historic emotional campaign in African football. In 2015, 3 years later, he did the same thing with Ivory Coast, that squad of Yaya Touré, Drogba, Kolo Touré. 2 AFCON trophies with 2 different national teams, a tournament considered one of the toughest in continental competitions. That's divine reverence in African national team football, meaning this guy isn't a stranger parachuting into Tunisian culture for the first time. He knows African football from the inside. He speaks the language of African players. He understands the religious, cultural, tactical context of these national teams in a way conventional European coaches rarely do. That's a huge advantage for an African federation in crisis in the middle of a World Cup. It's the difference between importing a generic commander and importing a commander who's already familiar with the whole environment. And there's an additional piece in this transition worth highlighting. Wahbi Khazri, that former Sunderland midfielder many Premier League fans still remember, and who was Sabri Lamouchi's assistant on the coaching staff, is staying on with Renard's staff. That's important tactical continuity. It means Tunisia's players, who already knew Khazri, will have a familiar figure serving as a bridge between the new commander and the dressing room. It's not a total transition. It's a rebuild on maintained foundations. So the Tunisian Federation isn't betting blindly. They're betting on 3 things: Renard's resume of World Cup miracles, his familiarity with African football, and the partial continuity of the previous staff through Khazri. If there's a possible configuration to squeeze milk from a stone in 4 days between Sweden and Japan, that's the closest possible configuration. But hold on to that hope for a moment, because the challenge Hervé Renard is receiving right now is possibly the toughest of his career. A fractured dressing room he's never commanded. For days to adjust the team. A red-hot Japan side up next. And an even stronger Netherlands waiting after that. Good luck, Frenchmen. You're going to need it. And that challenge, and the final verdict on this whole story, is what we're going to close on in the next block. Let's wrap this story by taking a step back and looking at it from a distance. 5 days into the World Cup. 1 national team. 1 5-1 loss against Sweden. 1 head coach dropped inside 24 hours. 1 historic record set that nobody wanted to set. And 1 replacement landing in Monterrey with a reputation for the impossible hanging around his neck. That's Tunisia today. That's the real picture. And inside that picture is everything that makes the World Cup the most dramatic tournament in world football. Speed of decision, institutional brutality, history being written in real time, a collective dream teetering on the edge of the cliff. And what's most fascinating is that the same picture can be read in 2 completely opposite ways at the same time. And both readings have real support. On one side, the courage reading. The Tunisian Federation looked at the problem, saw that the commander had lost the dressing room, saw that the numbers didn't support any hope of recovery, and chose to hit the red button before losing the whole World Cup in silence. It was fast, it was harsh, it was unpopular outside the country, but it was the move of a group that would rather try something different than accept elimination with a signature on the paperwork. They called back a guy who's already delivered a World Cup miracle before. And they threw the rest of the tournament into a survival card with a name, address, and signature. On the other side, the panic reading. A notoriously impatient federation ripping up a 3-year contract after a single match at a World Cup where the opponent was objectively superior. A coach with a real resume losing his job over circumstances that were never favorable to him from the day he was hired. A dressing room that was already fractured is now going to get more confusion, more change, more adaptation with 4 days to play against Japan. Changing coaching command doesn't fix collective identity problems. It just transfers responsibility for the chaos to another head. Both readings are true. Both hold up. And it's on you to decide which one speaks louder about what happened. So I want to ask you 3 specific questions before we close this video. Questions I genuinely want to see your take on down in the comments. First question. Do you think the Tunisian Federation was brave or cowardly? Was this a move of adult management, or was it just passing the bomb to the next commander while institutionally washing hands? Drop your read below with your reason. Second question. Do you think Sabri Lamouchi deserved more time? Or were the signs of dressing room fracture, broken protocol, and 5 months without producing tactical identity already enough to justify the decision? If you were a Tunisian Federation director, would you have given him a second match before pulling the trigger? Or would you have done exactly the same thing? And the third question, this is the one I'm most curious about. Do you bet Hervé Renard can grab any points against Japan or the Netherlands? Or is what happened to Tunisia just the first chapter of a fall that's now irreversible regardless of who commands this national team? Drop your prediction below, because we're coming back to this topic after the second round, and we're going to compare the community's predictions with what actually happened on the pitch. And before signing off, one big ask. If this breakdown gave you something you weren't going to find on regular sports channels, do the 3 things right now that keep this content alive. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications. Because I'll tell you straight up, this World Cup is different. 5 days in, and it's already sacked a coach. And that's not going to be the last head to roll. There are national teams at this tournament with worse internal atmosphere than Tunisia's, with players fighting in press conferences, with federations already preparing similar moves. This channel is tracking every single one of them daily. When the next commander falls, you'll be the first to know. Tunisia versus Japan happens in 4 days. It's going to be Renard's first test as commander. It's going to be the first real read on how the dressing room responds to a mid-World Cup change of command. And it's going to be possibly decisive for whether Tunisia still has any chance in this tournament, or if they're already with 1 foot out of history. Full breakdown coming to this channel. Game analysis, tactical adjustments, dressing room reaction, all of it. If you don't want to miss part 2 of this story, one more reason to stay subscribed. And I'll leave you with this final thought. We started this video saying that Tunisia did something no other national team had done in 96 years of World Cup history. Ending it, you now know why they did it and how they did it. What we don't yet know is whether this decision will go down in history as the boldest move of the 2026 World Cup, or as the moment a national team signed its own elimination. That part only the future tells. And the future starts in 4 days on a global broadcast. See you in the next one. You need to understand something about the Tunisian Football Federation before continuing this story. And that something is that it has a very specific institutional culture of making harsh decisions on the national team head coach. It's not an accident. It's not the isolated reaction of one single event. It's a repeated, documented behavior pattern that's been playing out inside this country for decades. Come back with me to January 2026. 5 months ago. At that moment, the manager of the Tunisian national team wasn't Sabri Lamouchi. It was another guy, Sami Trabelsi. Tunisian coach, with time in the national team as a player, a respected figure inside local football, with a consistent resume in the Tunisian league. He was leading the team through a crucial moment, the Africa Cup of Nations, the AFCON, which is the main national team tournament on the continent and the biggest showcase for Tunisian football outside of the World Cup. The AFCON was a complete disaster. Tunisia crashed out early against Mali, a respectable opponent, but well within expected competitive parity. And the loss against Mali was treated as a national humiliation inside the country. Harsh headlines, relentless media coverage, political pressure coming from every direction. What did the Federation do? They didn't wait for the mourning to end. They didn't give second chance. They didn't open a long process of reassessment. They fired Sami Trabelsi immediately. No ceremony, no waiting, no hesitation. And it was exactly this federation, this same group of directors, this same decision-making culture that hired Sabri Lamouchi as Trabelsi's replacement 5 months ago. Think about this detail carefully, because it's fundamental. Lamouchi wasn't stepping into neutral ground when he signed that 3-year contract with Tunisia. He was signing with the same federation that, months earlier, had fired his predecessor in a lightning move after a single continental tournament elimination. He knew, or at least should have known, exactly what kind of tolerance this board had for bad results. Zero. Absolute zero. And it's not just the Trabelsi case. If you go further back in time, this pattern shows up systematically. In 1998, as we already saw, it was Kasper Gzak. But also in the years between 1998 and now, a sequence of Tunisian and foreign coaches passed through the national team command, always with little margin for error, always with little time to build a project. Some lasted months, others a little longer. Few completed a full cycle between African Cups or World Cups. This isn't a bad phase right now, it's the structural way senior Tunisian football operates. The reason? Heavily tied to social pressure, to the historical expectation that Tunisia is one of the powerhouses of African football, and to Tunisian fan impatience with projects that don't show immediate results. It's a federation that works under constant pressure, that responds to headlines, that reacts to social media, that doesn't feel comfortable holding an unpopular decision for very long. Quick pit stop. This story isn't going to be the last coach falling at this World Cup. There are more federations preparing similar moves right now. If you want to catch every one of these coach falls the moment they happen, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications. This channel is tracking every single one of them daily. Okay, back to the case. Because he's not the first one caught by this institutional environment. He's just the most recent. The pattern the Federation established with Trabelsi in January just repeated at even greater speed with Lamouchi in June. Trabelsi fell after an AFCON. Lamouchi fell after a single World Cup match. The downward curve of this board's patience is obvious when you put those two dates side by side. And that, when you stop to think about it, has serious consequences for whoever comes next. Because the moment Tunisia announces the Lamouchi replacement, and they already announced him, we'll talk about that guy in the next blocks, the replacement will be walking into an environment where the cost of failure has been reduced to literally one game. One. Not even one full tournament phase. One bad night. One wrong press conference. One furious player storming off on live TV. Any of those things could be enough for the same decision-making culture to kick in again. And that changes everything for whoever's taking over the national team right now, mid-World Cup. It changes how he'll pick his lineup. It changes how he'll approach the press conference. It changes how he'll communicate with the dressing room. Because he knows the federation paying his salary operates with almost zero tolerance for error. And that if he stumbles, he could be the next name on this list. But before we move on to the replacement, there's one last thing I need to acknowledge in this story. Because up to now this video has been pretty hard on Sabri Lamouchi. Pretty critical. And pretty aligned with the Tunisian Federation's decision. But any honest football analysis needs to recognize the other side. Needs to recognize the context in favor of Lamouchi. Needs to recognize the circumstances he took over this national team under and the real limitations he had in his 5 months of work. Because there is an argument for Sabri Lamouchi. A serious argument. An argument any honest fan needs to consider before locking in an opinion on this case. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next block. The possible defense of Lamouchi. And why, despite it, the Federation may still have done the right thing.